Today's workshop comes from our Coping with COVID-19 series in regards to managing anxiety and acute changes. This workshop is through the Counseling and Psychological Services Office, CAPS, at the IU Health Center. We are located on the 4th floor, and you are able to get in contact with us just by calling 812-855-5711. So today's workshop is going to function just like any of our live web workshops do. So what you're going to need is about 45 to 50 minutes available to be able to do the workshop in its entirety. You will be encouraged to pause the video during any of the journal prompt activities to ensure that you allow yourself enough time to fully answer and complete the activities. The reason that we choose to do journal prompts is it gives you the opportunity to think further and really take home some valuable pieces of insight and information for yourself about what might be going on, especially in relationship for today's presentation to anxiety and acute changes related to COVID-19. So we encourage you to have a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper, though certainly if you would prefer to write or type out your answers, that will be fine too. So first things first, it is important for us to discuss adaptive anxiety, especially in relationship to COVID-19. And when we say adaptive anxiety, we mean that this is very normal, very valid in response to this global pandemic. It's not just something that we might be experiencing for mental health reasons. It's a sentiment that's shared by most. In fact, most people out there are feeling scared, fearful of the unknown, out of control, really uncertain about what their present and their future circumstances might look like, and altogether somewhat helpless, especially because we don't have a lot of control as to what's going on now and what's going to go on later. And so any of that anxiety that you are feeling is entirely normal. It's so normal that I'm certain if you were to ask someone if they're experiencing anxiety too, especially anxiety regarding going back to normal, going back out in public, so on and so forth, that is a sentiment that is shared. Now, because most individuals have been in quarantine for a while now and have been required to socially distance and life hasn't felt normal, that increased and chronic anxiety can certainly lead to different health problems like pain, fatigue, or increased inflammation. And because we do know that it has lasting impact on our physical and mental health, it is important that we spend some time today discussing how to effectively cope with that adaptive anxiety. As I've mentioned, a lot is changing on a day-to-day basis, and all of those changes can make it very, very difficult for individuals to cope because we might be coping with one thing 1 hour, and then the very next hour that thing changes, and now we have to restart over with how we're coping. If most of you remember back when COVID-19 really first started happening in the United States and things started shutting down, we could wake up one morning and hear that something had changed, and then the next morning or even later that day it had changed even more drastically. So it is certain that most of us are unsure how our near futures or distant futures will be impacted by the virus. So you might be having catastrophizing thoughts like, how bad is this going to get? What is next fall going to look like? Will blank be impacted or canceled? What's going to happen? So it's very, very easy to think worst case scenario. Unlike more typical related anxiety, we might be able to rationalize any of those catastrophizing thoughts away, being able to say, okay, I know that might not be rational, but I'm still thinking it anyways. In the case of adaptive anxiety, anxiety related to COVID-19, being able to rationalize those catastrophizing thoughts is a lot more difficult because we don't know and because worst case scenario has been happening. So for these journal questions, again, I encourage you to pause the video to allow yourself time to record your answers. I want you to think about what type of what-if thoughts do you typically have in relation to COVID-19. And when your anxiety related to the current pandemic is at an all-time high, what's going on? So think about that situation. What prompted that anxiety? Were you with anyone in particular? Were you talking about something particular, thinking about a particular event? What was the antecedent? Then what happened? What did that anxiety look like for you? And then were there any consequences? And then when you are ready, feel free to press play and you can move on. So in terms of anxiety, I do think it's important to help people understand what is going on in their bodies, just because our bodies are going through a fight, a flight, or a freeze response. And in many ways, from a physiological standpoint, anxiety can kind of work against us. A lot of the different physical symptoms that people experience when it comes to anxiety is our body's natural response to a threat. So essentially, everybody has a very primitive part of their brain. It's called the amygdala, and the amygdala is responsible for emotions. But because it is so primitive, and it came from the evolutionary standpoint of wanting to keep everybody safe from danger, it is easily activated. And while it was very, very functional for our ancestors in the past, needing to be able to understand when we might be exiled from a group and what that implication could be on us back in the day, or actually having to protect ourselves from threats in the wild, the amygdala sending our body into that fight, the flight, the freeze mode was very functional. It was very helpful. Now, today, sometimes it's functional, and more often than not, it's not actually functional, but it's our anxiety switch. It's trying to protect us. And so it is important for us to understand that while it might help us in many cases, there are plenty of instances in which it doesn't. So if you look at this chart here, which as you can see is taken from Psychology Tools, this is a really great job illustrating exactly what's happening in the body. And as you can see, all these different pieces like thought racing, increased heart rate, difficulty breathing, muscle tension, sweaty palms, all of those are symptoms that individuals typically complain of when they are experiencing anxiety. But from a physiological standpoint, because the amygdala is switched on, it's telling us it needs to keep us safe from danger. Each of these have very specific functions. So, for example, thoughts racing, that allows us to be able to evaluate threats really quickly and know how to respond. It doesn't oxygenate as much the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for memory, so that's where it becomes really difficult for us to remember to cope in all the ways that we might have been taught through therapy, support groups, any different workshops that we've attended, readings that we've done, so on and so forth. Our heart's beating faster because it's trying to feed more blood to the muscles and enhance our ability to fight something off or run away, just like our muscles are tensing in preparation to help us fight or run. As you can see, each of these have very specific functions. They're designed to help us, but from a thought perspective, it is very, very easy for us to misconceive what's going on and perceive that as being a very, very negative thing because it is so strongly associated with anxiety. So it is important to note that from a physiological standpoint, sometimes our bodies are working against us. Sometimes our amygdala is switched on and is mistriggered, and we're feeling exceptionally physically anxious about something when maybe we don't need to be, or those physical symptoms of anxiety activate the anxiety further. So essentially, there's a very primitive reason why individuals feel anxious. It's Mother Nature's way of trying to protect us by pushing us to resolve uncertainty and figure out a solution. That is a quote from Julie Pike, a clinical psychologist. I find it very important to help individuals know what's happening in their bodies, as it's important to normalize that is a very normal and valid response overall. And from a physiological standpoint, all of those physical symptoms are intended to be there. So many individuals' amygdalas are switched on pretty significantly right now because we're chronically thinking of worst case scenario and our anxiety is in overdrive. So I want you to pause the video and think about what have you done to try and control your anxiety, and how does that control strategy help you in the short term and in the long term. Pause the video to record your responses, and then when you are ready, you can press play to continue. So as we discussed, while it is vitally important that we can normalize and validate that anxiety, normalize and validate what's happening from a physiological standpoint, because there are negative physical and mental health effects from chronic and intense anxiety, it is necessary that we talk about available coping strategies for that adaptive anxiety. The first strategy involves this idea of controlling what you actually can control. So the truth is that most people spend a lot more time attempting to control what they can't and miss what they can control. So spending extra time on news apps thinking, okay, if I get this news first, it's going to magically change how terrible I feel about it. Or can I try and control the future? Can I try and control how other people feel about my choices when it comes to COVID-19? We can't control that. We can't control what's happening in general from like a governmental pandemic standpoint. But what we can control is our perception, our behaviors, coping strategies, so on and so forth. In addition to that, most humans tend to inappropriately or overly use control strategies, which can ultimately increase the stress and deplete the quality of life. So what you might be trying to do to control the anxiety and the distress that you're experiencing might end up causing more anxiety and distress. So we do want to encourage you to really reflect on those control strategies. Reflect on, are you attempting to control what you can't, and what are you using to control those negative emotions, and is that helping or is that hurting you and perpetuating that anxiety more? So in regards to COVID-19, you might be sitting here thinking, okay, Liv, but it literally feels like I can't control anything. So pretending I can control feels better than being helpless. And while I understand that, I encourage you to still try and break it down, even if it's tiny. Is there something that you can control? And even finding that very, very slight something, though it might not completely take the anxiety down from 100 all the way back to a 0, can help decrease it slightly and empower us to focus more of our time, energy, and efforts on eliciting control over something that we actually can control, rather than feeling disempowered when we try to control something we can't. So some things that you can do and control are how you spend your time. So what are you choosing to do to maintain connection with people? How are you choosing to spend your time in quarantine, so on and so forth? You can control your perspective and attitude toward COVID-19. Now, I'm not encouraging you to invalidate any of those negative responses. I'm just encouraging you to question and open up your perspective. Can this suck? Be very challenging, be very detrimental for all of us, be very scary, and are there aspects of anything related to this circumstance that we can be grateful for? Can we be grateful that we have our health? Perhaps it has offered you more time with somebody that you didn't anticipate you would get time with. Perhaps it has offered you something positive, and I encourage you to try and sit with both the positive and the negative emotions. Make room for them both. You can also control how you keep yourself safe amidst a crisis. We might not be able to control if our parent or grandparent goes out in public, though we can do our very best to offer them help and support to avoid them having to go out, but we can control that. So if we're highly uncomfortable getting our groceries, can we think about ordering our groceries? Can we think about wearing masks, gloves? What are you able to do to keep yourself safe? It could be going to a grocery store at a different time per day, avoiding the busier times because you know you're going to feel less anxious and more comfortable at the less populated times of day. You can also control what you do for self-care strategies, as well as planning for the short-term and long-term future. So if you're a planner, I encourage you to think about, okay, I might need plan A, B, C, and D right now. What are those? What does that look like? If this happens, then what? How will I make adjustments? How will I make room? My second tip is to mind your media consumption. And what I mean by this is that we often find that we as individuals consume media less intentionally, and it can have a pretty negative impact on our emotions and cause us a lot of distress. So while it is important that you stay up to date on information, especially given how rapidly things are changing, I do encourage you to start thinking about how your media consumption plays a role and has an impact on your anxiety and harm to your mental health. So our media today is very, very saturated with information about COVID-19. I swear you cannot turn the television on without seeing some form of coverage. And we find that constant monitoring of media outlets can actually become compulsive and counterproductive. And so we need to pay attention to when it's helping our anxiety and when it's fueling our anxiety. So yes, it is important that you stay up to date about the information in the world and in your community in particular, but recognize that there are some media outlets that may be saturated with misinformation, and it might be covered in a way that only fuels your fear. So I want you to think about, what is the relationship between your anxiety and COVID-19 media coverage? And then what sources are important for you to hear from regarding COVID-19, and what sources could you limit? Pause the video to record your answers, and when you're ready, press play. So just some strategies for working to mind your media consumption. What I encourage people to do is to first find 2 trustworthy sources. So who do you trust that you want to receive your news from? It could be the WHO, the World Health Organization, the CDC, your local authorities and health departments. Who do you trust? And then I encourage you to limit your exposure from other media outlets. So that could be deleting the news app from your phone and just going to very specific websites. It could be turning the notifications off on the news app so it doesn't just ping at times when it's not helpful for you, but limit your exposure to the other sources that aren't helpful. So I also encourage you to think about limiting how often you check for updates. And this limit is going to vary on a person-by-person basis, and we might need to be fluid about it. There might be times when we can take in that information twice a day, and then times when we might need to take entire days off from media exposure at all. And that's where it's really important that we gain strong insight and we pay attention to the correlation between anxiety and media coverage. So encourage yourself to think about when it's most appropriate for you to look at those sites, and then limit your access to them any other time. Continue to recognize when it's time to step away for media updates and turn off the notifications or delete the app from your phone. So again, being very, very insightful. And then if worst case scenario, if you limit everything and you're still concerned, how am I going to get the needed information? Ask a friend or family member, someone that's reliable, someone that isn't just going to continue to feed into those anxiety-provoking thoughts, intentionally or unintentionally, and encourage them to share any necessary information. And you can set parameters on that too. That is something you can control. You can let them know, here's what I don't want to hear about, here's what's not helpful for me, here is how I'm okay hearing about this. Tip 3 is focus on what is certain. And again, in a world where there is a lot of uncertainty right now, you might be shaking your head and going, okay, how is that possibly going to help? Because there's so much uncertainty. And we know that the uncertainty, the fact that things are so unknown, is the largest culprit to increasing and intensifying your anxiety. You can see here on this slide that some of these thoughts just hit the tip of the iceberg of those catastrophizing thoughts. Will my graduation be canceled in December? Will I have to reschedule my wedding? Will I have a job in 6 months? I signed a contract for an internship. Is that going to be possible? So while there's so much uncertainty and we want to normalize and validate that, it is vitally important to find ways to ground yourself to what is certain. Even if that certainty is a very, very tiny, it can help widen your perspective to include more than just those really negative catastrophizing thoughts. So some ways that you can focus on what is certain is planning for what you can. And so it is very natural to be concerned about what could happen and what can't happen, and being somewhat proactive about finding those answers can be helpful for someone. If this isn't you, skip this part, go on to the next part of this presentation. But if you think that this can be helpful, I encourage you sit down and write down all of the specific worries related to COVID-19. What are you fearful of in regards to things in general, how it might disrupt or has disrupted your life and your future plans? And then if you start to feel overwhelmed, take a break. That's okay. You don't have to power through this. Come back to it when you feel like you're in the right headspace. After you've done this, make a list of all possible solutions to the specific worry. So you could draw an arrow to that specific worry on your piece of paper and include anything that comes to mind. This is a brainstorming session, so I don't want you to self-filter out things that might not be perfect, things that you know, okay, that could work, but maybe not because of X, Y, and Z. List them all. We're not trying to get too hung up on finding the perfect solution right now. From there, I want you to focus on the concrete things that can actually be problem solved or changed. So this is where you're really going to have to dig deep, questioning, can this be problem solved? Can this be changed? Do I have control over this? Where don't I have control? So you might not have control over whether or not your study abroad plans will happen or be altered for this fall. But can you have a plan in place for how you choose to respond to it if that happens? Or you might say, I don't feel comfortable taking that chance, so my solution is that I'm going to study abroad for the winter break or the following semester or the following year. And then after you've evaluated your options, I encourage you to draw up concrete plans of actions. What are the steps that you can take? Take any immediate steps that are right in front of you. This can make you feel like you're more in control. And then once you've done everything that you can immediately, remind yourself of that every time that anxiety starts creeping back up. Did you do everything you could? Did you control everything that you were able to? If the answer is yes, continue to focus and remind yourself of that. My other suggestions include change your what if thoughts to even if thoughts. And the reason that I like this is I find that catastrophizing thoughts can really fuel that anxiety, especially because they often linger. We don't answer them. So it could be, well, what if my wedding gets canceled? What if I get the coronavirus? What if? And it's just hanging out there. It's floating in the stratosphere. So I encourage people to actually answer those thoughts. I'm not saying sit there, dwell on them. I'm just saying if that is really stressing you out, causing you additional anxiety, could answering them at least provide you some sense of anxious relief? And by asking even if, or changing the what if to an even if, that just naturally creates more space for it to be answered. So even if blank happens, I know that blank. Even if my study abroad trip gets canceled for the fall, I know that I will be able to make arrangements to go this spring. So even if the worst case scenario happens, what will I do? So even if I lose my job and get furloughed, I am able to do blank, apply for unemployment, move back home with my family, so on and so forth. Typically, I find that students find that this can help reduce anxiety somewhat because those what if thoughts aren't just hanging there. We have a plan of action. And then we know, even if the worst case scenario happens, I have a plan. And then anything else in between typically doesn't feel as scary for people. And then also remind yourself of what is certain, even if that thing is very small. So you might not be certain about what's going to happen, but you might be certain about the fact that you are resilient, you are a planner, you are very organized, and you will make adjustments as needed. You might be very uncertain about how your family or friends could be impacted by this, but what you are certain is that you love them and you will do whatever you need to do to attempt to keep them safe. Now, for our journal questions, I encourage you to think about answering some of those worst case scenario thoughts right now. So, and again, if this becomes too anxiety provoking, please do not continue to do that. Just move on to the next one. But if you're able to, think about those worst case scenario thoughts that you have and then answer them. Even if they happen, what will you do? What is your plan of action? And then what are 3 things you are certain of right now amidst the current crisis? Even if they're tiny, I encourage you to write them down. Pause the video to record your responses and then press play when you're ready. Tip 4 is to practice gratitude. And before anybody rolls their eyes because it sounds very hippy-dippy, I encourage you to to just wait, because we find that gratitude is very strongly correlated with a lot of different positive neurotransmitters in your brain. And we find that it is associated very strongly with happiness and the expression of thankfulness. And that expression can be in relation to a person, an event, a situation, an activity. And it can help build long-term relationships. It can help improve your resiliency, ability to handle and cope with adversity. And we all need that right now. Positive psychologists have studied this a lot, and they have found that there's a connection between practicing gratitude and good health. So utilizing a gratitude journal can actually decrease stress. It can improve your sleep. It can increase your emotional insight and awareness. It can have some really positive effects on us, which we all need right now. In addition to that, it also has some pretty significant correlations and effects on the happier neurotransmitters in your brain, like dopamine and serotonin. So those are responsible for helping you feel good. When you express gratitude, both of those neurotransmitters get released. And there are lots of studies out there that show these effects more. But for sake of time, I'm not going to go into them today. If you think that this is important for you to look into more, I encourage you to do that. At a neurobiological level, gratitude helps regulate your sympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system is very helpful in being able to regulate your anxiety. When you're experiencing those more physiological symptoms of anxiety, you are actually sent into your sympathetic nervous system that becomes very high, very activated, so we want to try and regulate that, and gratitude can certainly help. Now, again, what is important to mention is that when I'm encouraging you to be grateful and to express gratitude, I am not encouraging you to discount or invalidate yourself. I am not suggesting that you shouldn't feel scared, that you shouldn't feel any level of grief. Experiencing grief and fear in response to this global pandemic is normal. I'm just asking you, can you feel that grief? Can you feel anxious? Can you feel fear and express gratitude in an effort to widen up your perspective to include more than just any possible threats or any catastrophizing thoughts? So can you be sad about having to cancel your vacation, move your study abroad trip, maybe you're changing things related to an upcoming wedding or event, and grateful for blank. It could be the extra time that you have to work on your garden. It could be, I had to change my wedding location from this state to that state because their restrictions or level of COVID-19 is different. And perhaps that brings you closer to family, allows you to work with a venue that you didn't otherwise know you wanted, so on and so forth. Again, we don't want to discount those negative emotions. We just want to make space for positive ones too. My next set of journal questions encourages you to think about right now, what are 5 big or small things that happened today? Not yesterday, not tomorrow, not a week ago, today, that you are grateful for. And how can you practice gratitude more regularly to widen your emotional perspective? Pause the video, and when you are ready, press play and continue. My final tip is to practice self-care. And self-care, as we know, is just really vital for being able to cope with stress and anxiety. It can create consistency, routine. It can help reduce any of those chronic symptoms. So any tried and true self-care activity that you've used before, which could be deep breathing, could be sleep, it could be going for walks or other exercise, eating healthfully, social time, staying connected, anything you've tried before that has been helpful can and should still be included now. Now, will you likely need to be more creative about how you include that in your life? Will it always look the same? No. It will not always look the same. You will need to be more creative, and you will need to be much more intentional about the implementation of this, and that's okay. So if exercise, for example, was typically your coping strategy and you loved going to a hot yoga class, you might not be able to do that now. But I encourage you to ask yourself and admit, so I can't do this, and what can I do? What is available to me? Can I practice yoga at home? Maybe you tried yoga at home and you didn't like it. Before just throwing it by the wayside, I encourage you make adjustments, see what fits, certainly allow yourself space to be frustrated about the loss of that strategy as it was, and then continue to make adjustments from there. Other ways to practice self-care include be kind to yourself. So if you're feeling frustrated or anxious or overwhelmed by this, you can validate yourself. You don't need to just stifle those emotions down and say, stop it, you don't need to be feeling this way. No, it's okay for you to be feeling this way. It might not always feel helpful, so that's why we're going to validate it and cope with it. I've already mentioned making adjustments to your routine, so it's unlikely that you're going to be able to have life look exactly the same as it did pre-COVID-19, and that's okay. Validate that, normalize that, make any adjustments you can, and then attempt to maintain it in the best way possible. Again, still include the activities you enjoy most. So if you really enjoy staying connected, how can you continue to stay connected amidst everything right now? And then really question it. Am I doing what I need to do for an activity? I always say it's not what you do, it's why you do it. So if you are attempting to buy a Peloton bike because you think that your friend Karen loved it and you get it and you hate it, or you know you're not going to like a spin class, but you'd much rather rock taking walks outside every day, then choose to do that. If you think that that could help you and you know that that could alleviate any form of stress or anxiety, even in a small capacity, I encourage you to do that. Get out in nature and find ways to exercise despite the circumstances. And then make it a point to connect with 2 people every single day. So this might be a text or an email, but if at all possible, I encourage this to be a phone call or a FaceTime, Zoom call date with somebody. Find ways to feel connected, even if small. It's always quality over quantity here. So I encourage you to think about how can you practice and maintain self-care right now. So feel free to jot down your answers to that, in addition to what adjustments can and need to be made to your schedule to accommodate your current needs. Pause the video to record your answers, and then when you are ready, you can press play to continue. Now that is the main portion of our workshop today, so I want to move into ways that you can tell additional support is needed, and then what options are available to you from CAPS, our office, as well as other resources on IU's campus. Some good indicators that additional services are needed would include an increase in other mental health symptoms. While certainly it's very normal to feel anxious right now, you might notice that trying to engage in these strategies doesn't seem like it's enough. You are finding yourself feeling worse and worse. There might be changes to your sleep or appetite or hygiene. Any reduced academic, social, or other functioning. You might not be logging on for class. You might be completely distancing yourself from others, even virtually, whatever that looks like. And then, of course, any thoughts of suicide, homicide, or self-harm. Those are all good indicators that seeking additional services would be necessary. So I'm going to talk a little bit about CAPS's services and what it looks like during COVID-19, but I encourage you to always check our website for the most up-to-date information. So the Counseling and Psychological Services Office is available to help you. You are able to call us by calling 812-855-5711, and you can select option 1 for our crisis services, which are available 24/7. Now, if you are feeling any of those things listed on the slide before, I encourage you to consider getting scheduled for an initial counseling appointment. We are still available to provide virtual, individual, couples, and group counseling. If you are already an established client, you are able to call that number or get in touch with your provider to get on their schedule for a phone or video session. If you are new to us, you can call our number to schedule your first time appointment too. You'll meet with a provider for the very first time for about 30 minutes. You get to choose if you prefer if that's video or phone, and then from there you and that therapist will decide what the most appropriate and helpful plan of action will be. I already mentioned our after hours crisis line, but that is available again 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We also still offer virtual sexual assault counseling and crisis services, as well as having plenty of other free online workshops that are available, which includes our video library series where you are able to access this. We have live web workshops, which are run very similarly to how this was today. It's on Zoom, as well as mindfulness workshops as well. Now, our sexual assault crisis services, these counselors are individuals who are trauma informed. They are especially trained in being able to work with individuals who have experienced trauma or anything related to sexual violence. Our SAC services are an extension of CAPS, so these individuals are employed by CAPS directly, and all services are free. So this is available to anybody who has experienced a sexual assault or anything related to sexual violence or dating violence or interrelationship violence in general, stalking, anything you can see listed here. If you're wanting to discuss that, if that is a primary reason or an attribute to why you are coming into therapy, you are able to work with someone who is specially trained and equipped to help you manage those needs. And those free services include individual and group counseling, support groups, couples counseling, psychiatry care, any information and assistance with medical, judicial, or legal issues. And then they also have their own after-hours crisis line. It is 812-855-8900. Please note that that is different than CAPS's after-hours emergency services line. And as always, these services are available for all genders and identities. And that is the end of today's presentation. Certainly, if you have any additional questions, I encourage you to explore our website, log on to any of our live workshops, or feel free to explore the video library and other services that we have available. We are always available for you by calling 812-855-5711. Select option 1 for our after hours crisis line.